Hi, and welcome back. I'm Hank Preston, a developer evangelist with Cisco DevNet, and today we're going to talk about data formats, understanding and using JSON, XML, and YAML. This video is part of the Network Programmability Basics video course and is the lead lesson inside of the Programming Fundamentals module. Other lessons in this module include an introduction to REST APIs and how to get started with Python and understanding those scripts, so make sure that you tackle those lessons as well. During this lesson, I'm going to do some coding. We're going to look at some capabilities. If you want to follow along with me, please do. I encourage it. Jump up to GitHub and go to github.com/cisco-devnet/netprog_basics, and you can download all of the code and the examples that are going to go through. Each lesson and lab involved in the Network Programmability Basics video course has a README that provides all the details on how to install all of the tools and prerequisites necessary for this lab. And if you do need infrastructure to run the code against, DevNet Sandbox is ready to go. The specific sandboxes and information to get started are also included in those READMEs. So take a minute, go check that code out, and let's get started. So let's dive right in. What are we going to go through? We're going to talk about the importance of a data format in programming and how to choose which one over the other. We'll look at the common data formats in programming. Those are XML, JSON, and YAML. And then we'll demystify XML, we'll break down JSON, and we'll simplify YAML so that you don't get scared when you see those in the different use cases that they come through. So the importance of a data format. Why do we care? Why do we have all of these different data formats, and why are they used in programming? And it all starts with a simple fact. You must know your audience. So here's a common example of some data that we might see in as a network engineer, right? The output of the show interface brief command. Now this output was designed for a person. It was designed for a human to read. And as we can see, Carl is super happy about this. He can look at this, he understands that he's got three interfaces, the IPs, and it's easy for Carl to consume this data format that's out there, this basic text format. Now Devi, who's representing our APIs or our infrastructure or our programming script that's out there, well, Devi can muddle through this, but he is a bit confused. He's got to figure out, what does each of these blocks of strings mean? Where does one end in another? What's valid information, and how to consume those? So data formats are all about the audience. Who is the data for? And in this case, the clear text that's traditionally used in network space, well, that's targeting you and me, the human, or Carl in this case. Now, if we dive deeper and we look at data formats intended maybe better for Devi, in this case, we have a data format example. This is very structured data. It's easy to break down for our code to go through, and as we can see, it makes Devi smile. He's happy when he sees a data format like this. Now Carl can look at it and he's like, all right, it's not as easy as the table, but I can muddle my way through this and I can consume it. So this is considered targeting, this is a data format targeting our script or a programmability element, Devi, and it's human readable, like we can deal with it. It's not binary, we don't have to go decode something, which would also be great for Devi, but in our case, wouldn't be very helpful for us. So knowing your audience is why the data format's so important. It's why things like XML and JSON and YAML have become popular, is because in these cases, it's not about you. It's not about Carl and making him happy. It's about making Devi and all of our script and our code happy as we go through. So what are the common data formats in programming you'll be exposed to? Well, we've mentioned them already, right? So what we have here is we have three blocks of data. We have data in the three common programming formats that are out there. So in each of these examples, it's the details about a specific network interface. Gigabit Ethernet 2 provides its description, its IPv4 address, the exact same information in JSON, XML, and YAML. So one of the first things to recognize about data formats is that it doesn't matter what data is in there. In general, you can represent any type of data using any of the formats. And the reason you would pick one over the other comes down to two factors. One, what is the purpose? Who's the audience? If the tool, the script, the programming language you're working with requires one format over another, well, it makes it really obvious. Pick the format the language uses. If the language can support any of them, pick the one you want to use, right? Which one are you more comfortable with? Which one makes it easier for you to work with? Those are the two elements that makes you pick one format over another. First, is one required? Second, which one do you want to use? Outside of that, any format should be as good as any other. Now, if we dive into each of these formats, there are some common characteristics that go through. So each data format will have a syntax, a way that the format is laid out. How do we deduce it? Are they using characters like curly braces and square brackets? Where are quotes used? Are commas important, and are they used in different areas? The concept of an object. And an object in programming can become very confusing of a topic when you dive deep into it, but just think of an object as something you're talking about, an element that has some characteristics. And so each of these data formats have a way to represent an object that has characteristics that we're going to go through. Some of those characteristics, or actually many of them, will be broken up into the concept of key value notation. And we'll dive deeper into that in just a moment. But each data format language has a way to represent the keys and values to go through. And so it's important to recognize, as you look at a data format, how does it deal with keys and values? And then just as important are arrays or lists. We'll have lots of bits of information that are lists of options, right? A list of interfaces, a list of IP addresses, a list of statistics. So how does that data format deal with the list is the other common element we want to look at as we go through here. So as we can see, we've got our caveman back in the Stone Age laying out his priorities of fire, water, and club so he can make his life easier. Now, key and value notation, as I mentioned, is super important in every data format that goes through. But it's not complicated. The common way you'll look at key values is in this kind of colon-separated notation. It's not the only way, as we'll see, but it's a common way to look through. The key identifies or labels the data, and it's often the left side of the colon, right? In our image here, it's green. So the key is the left side, and it identifies what is the data that we're looking at. The value, right, that's the actual data, right? The key is identifying a particular value that's out there, and it will show up on the right side of the colon. Now, the value could be something simple. It could be a string or a number, or it could be a case of true-false. But the values can also be complicated. A key's value could be an entirely new object that contains lots of its own data on that. And we'll look at some examples of how those go through. So here in the yellow box, right, we've got an example of some key value pairs. Name is the key. Gigabit Ethernet 2 is our value. Description is the key. Wide area network is the value. And enabled and true on that. Key value pairs, this concept of labeling a data and then having a value of a data is hugely important across all of the data formats we'll look at. Now let's demystify XML, right? XML is one of the first data format languages that kind of dove into programming. It wasn't modern programming concepts that were out there. Now, XML stands for Extensible Markup Language, and we've got an example here we'll look at more as we go through. But if we think about what XML is, and we go back to knowing our audience, XML is a human-readable data structure that applications use to store, transfer, and read data. So XML is not about making life easier for you, me, or Carl. XML is about making life easier for your actual applications or scripts to leverage as far as we go through there. Now, key characteristics about XML is it was originally designed for the internet. It looks and feels a lot like HTML because they're both markup languages. Now, XML will have a schema or namespace that defines the information that you're after inside of here, and we can see that referenced inside of the line with XML namespace, and this is tying back to a Yang data model inside of the network area. Tags are very heavily used inside of XML. They surround the different elements that are going to be in there, and the key value representation is done with these tags, and we have opening and closing tags. Now, something that's to look at when we look at data formats is white space important or significant to the format itself? And with XML, white space is not. In this case, we can see that the data format has got lots of white space added, some indentation, but that's purely to make it easier for us, the human, to read it. As far as the script or application is concerned, the white space is insignificant. Now let's look deeper into this XML block and kind of identify how these pieces go through. So inside of here, as I mentioned, the related set of data is always going to be surrounded by different tags. And so we can see the object for this one is surrounded by the open interface tag and then the close interface. And each tag pair in XML will end with one of these slashes to indicate the close tag that goes through. Now this object, this element that's in there of interface, is composed of many other key value pairs as well as objects that are there. And so we can see that the interface has a key value pair of name with the value of Gigabit Ethernet 2. It also is composed of other objects. And so we can see this IPv4 block, which contains addresses that are inside of there. And so the data format with XML, we can embed and nest in different objects that are there. So an object can contain basic information, such as name, or it can contain more complicated data objects like IPv4 addresses or address or other characteristics that are in there. If we go through and look at the actual, how we look at lists of data inside of XML, we can see that an individual XML attribute can be repeated over and over again to represent lists. So in here, we can see that I've got an instance of an address, and then I have another instance of an address, and then a third instance of an address. And this would be represented to your application as a list of addresses that are out there. So we have 3 addresses, and each one of those addresses has an IP address and a network mask key with related values that go through on there. So lists are shown up simply by repeating the tag for that element that you're interested in. Now that we've looked at XML, let's look at JSON and how it relates and how we represent some of these same aspects inside of JSON as a different data format that goes through. Now, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and similarly to XML, it is a human-readable data structure that applications will use to store and transfer and read data. That's exactly what I talked about with XML, because as I mentioned, each of these data formats are simply doing the same thing. It's providing something for our applications to use that we can just muddle through if we need to, but the target is for the applications after that. And here we're going to look at the exact same set of data that details about that Gigabit Ethernet 2 interface, but now we're going to look at it inside of JavaScript. So the key characteristics of JavaScript are it is a data interchange text format that goes through that heavily uses curly braces and square brackets to show the arrays and lists that are through there. Key values are important to JavaScript as in any one, and this is where we start to see that colon separation that we talked about when we just define key values on its own. And very similarly to XML, any white space that's included is purely for us, the human consuming and reading the data. It has nothing to do with how the JSON will be consumed by your application or script. All the white spaces are relevant as far as your code is concerned. Let's dive into this block and take a look at its key aspects inside of the code. So everything inside of a JSON object starts out with these curly braces or indicators. So we can see the whole object is indicated with this open and closing curly brace that goes through. And then inside there, we can see the main object we're interested in is this IETF interfaces object. Again, that same type of data that we looked at with XML. Now, the IETF interfaces is a key. It's the key that identifies the object we're looking at. And then all of the value for it are different attributes that are in there as we go through. So we can see the IETF interfaces interface key. Inside it, it has a name, a description, it's enabled, and all these other elements that are in there. If we dive in and we look specifically at the key value pairs that are there, I want you to notice this comma at the end of it. Because of the way that JSON works, the only way that JSON can recognize when a list of something ends is by using those commas. And so at the end of each one of these areas, we'll see a comma that pops up as that goes through. I'll actually notice as I look at this, I'm missing one. This should be quoted and then have a comma at the end. So live typo correction in my slides. Look at that. Now as we go through on here, at the very last one, so this last element here inside of this list is the IETF IPv4. It's composed of everything from this point down to here, and you'll notice there's no comma in this position. That's because that's the end of the list of objects that are in there. We don't need to show it as it goes through. Now if we think about how these go in, let's take a look at the lists as there in kind of a deeper example. So now we have our list of addresses that are there. So again, we start out with the open and close curly braces because that's how JSON will start out. And then we get into our list of addresses. We know that these are addresses because it starts out with this key that's there. We don't repeat the addresses, we just create a list object. And those lists are indicated by these square brackets that open and close the list inside that's there. We have our 3 instances of the address that's there. We've got 1, 2, and 3 as they go through, right? 1, 2, and 3. And each one of those contains an IP address and a network mask. So this gives us the ability to list out 3 different addresses using JSON that's in there. And here we have it correct. We can see, if I erase these so we can see them better, we can see the first address ends with a comma. The second address also ends with a comma, but there is no comma on the third one because that's the last element in the list. Misplacing, either forgetting or putting extra commas in are a common way to have errors in your JSON notation, so look for those as you work with them. Now we've gone through XML, we've gone through JSON. Let's look at the third and final of our data formats that we're going to be exposed with in a common basis that's out there, and that's YAML. So YAML, or YAML ain't markup language, right? When we talk about programming, particularly some of these open source, sometimes we get to see some jokes and things worked into the titles, and here's an example. But there's something important about that. YAML ain't markup language. It wasn't designed to be like XML, where it's a markup with tags that are out there. And in this case, though it is also a human-readable data structure that applications will use, this one was more heavily weighted towards human-readable than we saw with XML or JSON. YAML in general is the most human-readable, even though it's just as easy for programs to use, which is making it very popular with newer projects that are out there. So once again, we have our YAML block looking at our Gigabit Ethernet interface. We dive into some of the aspects of YAML. As I mentioned, this was very much focused on making it even more human-readable than the other examples that are out there. So it's a minimalist format. It's commonly used with configuration files that are out there. Ansible heavily uses YAML, as does other tools like OpenStack. Now, whereas with XML and JSON, whitespace was purely for us, the humans consuming it, in YAML, whitespace is very much important because that's how we define the structure of a YAML file. There are no commas inside of YAML. All of the indentation, anything at a common indentation space is considered related at the same level of the object that's there. And then keys and values are also represented by, or separated by the colon. And what's interesting to notice as we're in here, there's no quotes. We don't see quote symbols that are here. Now YAML can support quotes if necessary, but in general it will try to assume what data type is intended. So if you put a value that is a string, like Gigabit Ethernet 2, it will be assumed to be a string. If you put in a number, a 1, a 2, 1.2, or a float indication like that, YAML will assume that that is a number and is meant to be a number on that area. But you can be explicit with quotes if you need to. Let's dive deeper into this object and see how this YAML bit is put together. Now, as I mentioned, the white space is super important with YAML. So all of the related data inside of a particular object will be at the same indentation level. So what we can see here is we've indented 2 characters underneath the IETF interfaces interface, which is the name of the object, and then everything at that layer is part of the same object and are attributes of the same object that go through. Now, if we further look at where the white space is, we can see our list that's in there, we'll talk more about, is indented, which shows that this address is part of that block that's there. Now, an individual object can contain many other attributes. So this IETF interface is just like we saw in XML and in JSON, has its name, which has a value of Gigabit Ethernet 2, so that colon separation for key values. It has enabled with value of true, and all the pieces are in there. So a YAML object, very easy, it's a minimal area. And just to reiterate, because I've seen these come up as other issues with folks, is there are no commas ending any of these. They just end at the end of the piece. There's no need to put a comma separation that's in there. Now if we look more at the lists of data that are there, if we don't have all just key value, just want to list out some information, these can easily be composed as YAML objects that are there using the dash character. So a dash character indicates a list element. So in here we have our addresses, again, is the name of our list, and then it has 3 elements. And each element is indicated by that dash symbol. So we have 1, 2, 3 elements of our list. Now that each element is a key value pair. Each element has an IP and a net mask, just like we've seen in the other examples. So YAML lists, YAML key value pairs and objects, very easy to work with as we go through on that. Now that we've gone through our data formats, let's kind of review where we've been at, because this is a fundamental information necessary as we jump into some of the other topics in the Network Programmability Foundations course. So, the importance of the audience. The data format is not about the programmer or the person writing the code. The data format is all about the audience, who's supposed to consume it. And so if your consumption audience, the primary audience, are other engineers and people that are just going to read it with their eyeballs, clear text is great. But if your main target audience for this application is a machine, a script, an application, options like XML, JSON, and YAML are much better choices than clear text. Data formats are mostly interchangeable. We can show the same data in all of the data formats that are out there. The reason you might pick one over another, again, is about the audience. Does the audience only understand one? Or do you prefer one if the audience doesn't care which one you're using? All of these are important elements of data format. Now where do we go from here, right? Remember, this is part of the Network Programmability Basics video course that we're putting out there, and this is the start of the Programming Fundamentals module. So be sure to follow and complete the entire course to jumpstart yourself into the network engineer of a programmable age. Run the examples yourself. If you didn't do them as we watched the video, by all means, you can stop at the end of this one, go download that code, run all those examples, see how they work, play around with JSON, play around with the YAML information that's in there, and you can go through. And then be sure to join DevNet. In addition to the content that you're looking at here, we've got more learning labs and development sandboxes, as well as lots of code samples and API guides for all of our infrastructure and technology that's out there. If you've got more questions, you can always find me. I'm available on Cisco Spark or via email at hapresto@cisco.com. I'm quite active up on Twitter at hfpreston, talking all the time about programmability concepts and networking, as well as cloud or DevOps. And then be sure to follow Cisco DevNet at Twitter at Cisco DevNet or up on Facebook. And both myself as well as the full DevNet crowd are very active up on GitHub, posting code samples across a variety of topics, so be sure to follow us up there as well. Thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed this presentation on data formats. And as I mentioned, stick around and make sure to go through the lessons on APIs and Python that come next in this module. Thanks.